So this is a controversial book, and some of the reasons for that are good, some of them are not so good. The good reasons are that the guy who wrote this book turns out that probably the way he made most of his money is by selling get-rich-quick courses, which that's always a scam. Anyone who's charging you tens of thousands of dollars to tell you how to get rich, the way they're getting rich is selling you these courses. And my father did a bunch of courses like this. Mostly it was the Millionaire Mind, it was called. And when I was telling my mother about my ideas, I want to start a business, she's like, oh no, are you doing like your father with the rich dad, poor dad thing? Which, different animal, same concept. And so I don't know if this book was written as a advertisement for the courses, but definitely I'd say that's a valid criticism of the author of the book. However, is the advice in the book good, or is the advice in the book bad? And one thing, so I had a friend who read it and complained, like, he didn't say anything new, he didn't say anything very specific. And this is one of those people, my friend, who I think there's a lot of people who will read things that are new and they don't get, but they don't get them. And I've been there too. And I'll talk about Gary Tobes at some point. Like, there have been things that I've read and it was new to me and I didn't even get what they were saying because it was outside of my frame of reference. However, this book does have 3 lessons in it that are novel to me that I think are actually useful. And of course, I'm telling you them, so you don't have to read this book to get those out of it, but you might still get other lessons out of it if you want to read it. If you don't want to give this guy money and he is, kind of a scammer, then you can get it from the library. I'm sure your local library has it because it is one of the most popular money books ever written. But the 3 lessons that I learned. So first of all, I didn't realize that most middle-class people think a house is an asset. I have always known that a house is a liability, and that the boomers, it was an asset, but that's because of government policy that artificially propped up housing prices by restricting how new housing could get built, as well as subsidizing homeownership and keeping taxes low for people who bought their houses forever ago. And so I knew housing is generally not a way to get rich unless you're like a landlord and you have apartments, but even then, like, you're not going to get nearly as rich as with other kinds of investments, which is why, if you know real estate investment trust REITs, they generally have, when you factor in the cost of managing them, lower returns than similar stock things. And if you're knowledgeable about real estate and you know where to buy stuff and how to fix it up, you might make a profit being a landlord. But in general, it's not the best way to make money, especially passive income. And certainly your own house as an investment, like, that is not an investment. The boomers put their thumbs on the scale, and that means that it's likely that it's going to be a negative, like, housing for us is probably, my generation is probably going to lose value, if anything. And the reason I bought a house was not as an investment, but because I wanted the peace of mind of knowing I can't be evicted and I'm not going to have huge surprise, like, housing increases. The property taxes keep going up. And I mentioned I live in a mixed income neighborhood, but I live in one of, it seems to be 2 mixed income neighborhoods in an area that's otherwise wealthy people with beach houses. So I live in one of the 2 parts of this area where you don't really have a lot of access to the beach. And then everyone else around here is, and so I didn't even realize that. And so my house gets compared against those wealthy neighborhoods and then appraised like $100,000 above what I actually paid for it. And I didn't pay a lot, like, compared to, I paid less than my parents paid for their house in New England, like 30-ish years ago. I think it's 30 years ago. And paid a little more than my father, when they divorced, paid for his house in Turner's Falls, but not a lot. So by American standards, my house was pretty cheap, but I didn't buy it as an investment. I bought it to have the peace of mind of thinking the rent wouldn't go up and having control over what I do with it. And insurance can also go up as an issue, especially because I live in hurricane country in Houston, which is one of many reasons I want to get out of here. However, the other things, so I mentioned 3 things. So I didn't realize that most middle-class people actually believe housing is an investment, which the boomers made it into an investment, but it's not, like, it's by policy, rent-seeking policy, basically. And then the 2 other things that were new to me. So one of them is he talks about most people don't have the courage. They're sheep. They don't want to work for themselves. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's entirely fair. The school system and middle-class values, and I have this term I call mixed loves for middle-class self-limiting attitudes and values, they teach us this attitude, and they teach us that it's safe. And even when we have these entrepreneurial instincts, if you fail at all, the pressure is, okay, try to go the safe route of employment. But I'm going to talk about, I don't think that's the natural instinct of people. It certainly was not my natural instinct, and it was sort of pressed on me. And so I think probably Rich Dad came from a poor background because, ironically, poor people have less of these mixed loves, and so they're more likely to, from what I've seen, actually start a successful business than middle-class people. And meanwhile, the actual rich, the actual elites, don't have these self-limiting attitudes, and they start businesses freely, and if they do work as employees, it's with a lot of leverage and very favorable working conditions, and it's often like a sinecure. But then the third thing, so I mentioned three things. So first one is, didn't realize middle-class people didn't realize housing was an investment. Second was, he talks about this attitude that most people don't want to work for themselves, and that got me thinking, and I'm like, no, I think most people, at least a lot of people probably would, but if you're middle class, there is a strong pressure that you're wrong and don't follow this instinct, and that the supposedly safer route is working a job. And it certainly is in the near term as well. And then the third thing is, he talks about, don't try to cut your expenses, try to grow your income. And that is something that is so stereotypically, especially with poor people, like doing MLMs, where they spend money they don't have and expect they're going to make it back, that it's sort of a stereotype among middle-class people. No, you don't do that. But it actually, there are times it makes sense. And my grandfather would always say, if money can solve a problem, it's not a real problem. And my mother, even though she was cheap when I was growing up, would always encourage me, yeah, just spend money to solve this if it's going to be difficult, as long as you can afford to. But again, it was contrary to how my mother acted as like a middle-class person when I was growing up, where she was always focused more on saving than spending. And I've talked about how my mother encouraged my father to try to start a medical records software company, and my father was not interested in doing that. And meanwhile, my mother got headhunted by Panera Bread, and she refused to take that either. Like, they both, that was not entrepreneurship, but they still both refused to take opportunities that were offered to them that would have been very good opportunities. So my mother was focused on trying to save as much money as she could, instead of actually figuring out how she could make more money. And she tried to get my father to do it, but she certainly never thought about doing that herself. And I think, don't spend money that you don't have, but your expenditures can exceed your outlays if you have reasonable expectation that your income is going to grow. And that has been helpful for me to realize. And I'm not approaching it the same way as this guy did, because I have a very different approach where I'm working backwards and trying to grow slowly. But I realized, yeah, it is, to the extent you can, it makes a lot more sense to try to figure out how to get more income than it does to spend less. But you can't do that with a salary, so you need to work for yourself. And I wouldn't encourage, if it's a well-known side hustle, it's probably not going to make a lot of money, and it's definitely not going to make a lot of money long-term if everyone's doing it. There's a saying that if it was easy, everyone would do it, but I would say the more accurate thing is, if it was easy, obvious, and beneficial, everyone would be doing it. And so people promoting side hustles, generally either they have a special advantage that you don't have, or everyone's doing it and it's not going to benefit you much, if at all. But I still think there were, again, 3 insights I gained from this book, and it's a short book that's relatively easy to read. And I don't think the issue is not being specific. I think he just gives the advice in an oblique way. And I think there's at least some solid advice, or at least insights in here. So even if it's not an amazing book, I think it's worth reading if you want to get it from the library and you're interested in this. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all on the next one.